one of the oldest criminal gangs in the United States. They were a force to be reckoned with, from working with the mafia to organizing murders. This is the story behind the Dogtown Gang, the oldest gang in Los Angeles. Development. Italian migration proved to be incredibly influential in the United States, beginning in the late 1700s and culminating in 1870. By then, there were over 25,000 Italians living in the country, and by the end of 1910, there were over 4 million. It was a time of prosperity for the U.S., which at its industrial peak benefited from cheap labor from neighboring Mexico, resulting in the arrival of some 75,000 immigrants. It also became home to the Japanese, Irish, and other Eurasian nations of the time, some fleeing oppression, others like the Irish fleeing disease. But it was not like that all over the country. There were groups of people that didn't have the resources for housing, unable to find work, who needed a roof over their heads. There were always small communities where these people lived, enclaves with inferior houses, often bordering on ruin. It was common for many of these communities to survive through extortion, theft, or some other criminal activity. In Southern California, one of these communities formed in an area nicknamed Dogtown, near downtown Los Angeles. Although a local urban legend suggests that the name came from the dogs that roamed the area, this is an unfounded rumor, as the rules for catching dogs were very strict at the time. The name probably came from a dog pound in the area. This place in the 1870s was one of the greatest peaks of Italian immigration, an area inhabited mainly by southern Italian immigrants, a large number from the island of Sicily. The Matranga War. For decades, all of California was controlled by the Matranga crime family, who ruled the state for years. They controlled the sale of fruit, but the Matranga name comes from a family hundreds of generations deep. It was common for them to control Los Angeles in many ways, using violence, arson, and extortion. The street gang Dogtown paid them protection money, being such a small group. Side note, Dogtown, later known as Dogtown Reformos or just Dogtown 13, is not to be confused with Dogtown of Venice Beach, as this was Venice's nickname and a group made up of wayward skaters, surfers, and gangbangers from Venice. Besides, downtown LA and Venice Beach are 15 miles apart, and C.R.U.S.H unit can unequivocally say, unequivocally?
Oh, you see this knife? I'm gonna teach you to speak English with this fucking knife.
C.R.U.S.H unit can, without a doubt, say it's a coincidence, and they're only related by name, with no criminal association. Back in downtown LA, there were other growing gangs such as the North End or the Black Hand, led by Joseph Ardizone, who had to endure the clashes against the family in 1906, a time when they were led by Rosario Matranga, also known as Sam, along with the rest of the family, Salvatore Matranga, Pietro Peter Matranga, and Antonio Tony Matranga. Ardizone was involved in a dispute with George Maizano that eventually led to a gang war. Maizano was killed in July and Ardizone fled shortly thereafter. The war would continue for years until Sam and his successor, Pietro Peter Matranga, were assassinated in late 1916 and lost power by 1920, ending the war. The downtown gang remained neutral until they formed ties with Ardizone, having a very good relationship and giving him more leeway, thus introducing a darker side to Sicilian and Italian culture to LA. The criminal reign of Black Hand. Black Hand's reign continued in this mob war, their power one that the Matranga family once held, but the Matrangas were no longer the strongest association. Joe, along with his right-hand man, Vito Di Giorgio, and the organization's second-in-command, Rosario De Simone, maintained good relations with Dogtown and the New Orleans Mafia, adding to their influence. By 1931, the Matranga family no longer wielded as much power, even with the deaths of its leaders and other heavyweights. Joe Ardizone would become the undisputed leader of the Los Angeles Mafia. Along with his association with Jack Dragna, their power and influence in the city was immense, having both senators and other political figures in their pockets, until Joe simply disappeared. One day, mysteriously and without explanation, all power fell to Dragna. After that, he made a deal with the rest of the Mafia and made peace, which brought him quite a bit of calm. The only hitch was that the Black Hand had to become a family mafia, and he kept his friends close and his enemies closer. The reign of this organization lasted for many years, but the involvement of Dogtown only lasted until 1941, when an event would change the game and cause the gang, made up of Italians, Irish, and Mexicans, to split and reform, leaving the Mafia War. William Meade Homes. The dilapidated homes of Dogtown, which had functioned as such since time immemorial, were threatened in 1937 by the Federal Housing Act. They faced the imminent end of their homes. It seemed suspicious that with Dragna's power, the proposal was mysteriously rejected due to budget constraints, thus avoiding a solution to this problem. The problem worsened in 1941 with the outbreak of the Second World War, where financial maneuvers and a strategic proposal managed to reduce the budget to just over $20,000, with the condition that part of the housing be allocated to American soldiers engaged in the war. This would sign the bill that would lead to the end of the Dogtown gang organization in the city of LA. But was it really the end? For better or worse? No. However, some groups, mostly Mexican and Latino, who kept the name, moved to other states. Nevertheless, there were attempts to take over the territory during the Great Depression of the early 40s. The organization, now even stronger, tried to establish this area as its base, which it eventually did. A new era. After the events that took place here, several decades of inactivity followed, during which they simply remained as another gang that managed to survive the extermination of mafias and criminal organizations. In the 1970s and 1980s, they expanded to other states, such as Utah, where they committed various acts of petty crimes like vandalism. They then went through years of relative inactivity until 1998. For generations, the gang had beef with other barrios like Clover Street, Rockwood Street, and the Avenues, when Dogtown established themselves in the Highland Park area of northeastern LA. These group of rivals were in constant warfare. But what happened on August 29, 1998 is perhaps one of the most socially devastating hits these gangs have ever taken. Steven Morales was a 12-year-old boy who had gone to play with his friends on the street, something he did every day. No one thought anything bad would happen since adults were around to supervise them. But some of these kids ran with the Avenues gang, including a member called Big D, making everyone a target by association. A black van slowly approached the area, parked in a strategic spot, and guns were pulled. They were all shot at, resulting in young Steven's death. Tragically, the soldiers in this battle were not hit, and only Steven was gunned down. Alvaro Herrera, who was driving the truck used in the shooting, told his girlfriend what happened, and it didn't take long for the rumor to spread. Everyone began to learn about Steven Morales' death, and soon an investigation implicates Herrera. An all-out gang war was looming, and Herrera was being investigated for the murder of the 12-year-old boy. That's why Herrera told his girlfriend Sheila that his best option was to flee to Mexico, to a small farm owned by his parents. Sheila was talked into going on the run with him, thinking they'd lay low for only a few weeks. Things got complicated, but they did manage to skip the country. A few months after this incident, the authorities would conduct an investigation that would implicate both Alvaro Herrera and Joaquin Gonzalez, an Avenues member who survived the assassination attempt. He testified about the shooting of young Steven, although he claimed that he never heard the gunshot. He did, however, claim to have seen the child fall to the ground. He was able to identify the vehicle and the people in it, although he never admitted it, as there is a code of ethics that prohibits snitching. The couple hid in Mexico for 2 years. Some say Herrera continued his criminal activities and began to physically abuse Sheila. In the year 2000, she somehow managed to convince Herrera to allow her to visit a relative. She contacted her parents and a few weeks later took off from Mexico to get away from her boyfriend. Just a year later, the rivalry was still going strong. Anthony Anguino had decided to go to a party with a group of friends. That day, they prepared everything. They didn't bring food or drinks, but they did bring weapons. At the party was the Cabrera family, which was not a criminal family. The only criminals were Joseph and his friend Danny, who were throwing the party in Lincoln Heights. Anguino didn't come with the intention of starting shit, but he did wait with his boys to avoid being seen by any rivals. When they did decide to leave, they did so carefully. Both Danny and Joseph sat down to rest, smoke some weed, and relax for a while, unaware that they were targeted and a shootout would begin. In July 2001, Joseph Cabrera was shot 10 times and Danny Ramos was critically wounded. Shortly thereafter, the cops arrived and determined that it was a gang-related event because of the Clover graffiti. The investigation later revealed that it was indeed a Dogtown Refamos attack, and Anthony Anguinado was the prime suspect, alleged to have shot the young man from behind with a 9mm pistol. A month later, Anguinado was driving when he was stopped by a police officer, who searched him to make sure he wasn't carrying anything illegal. A 9mm pistol was found and he admitted that it was his, and the officer decided to confiscate it for forensic analysis. However, this test was never completed, leaving this key member of the gang free to carry out new attacks. After that, the gang tried to keep everything on the down low, but couldn't help campaigning on the streets through graffiti and generally hanging out in their neighborhood. This so-called peace and calm didn't last long. The fall of Dogtown. Following these events, the gang was at a pivotal moment. They managed to carry out some murders, not all of them clean, and what would happen in 2006 and 2007 would be crucial for Dogtown Rifa. In 2006, Alvaro Herrera would continue his criminal life, stealing and spending money on drugs, until he was tracked down by the law and the extradition process began. It would take 6 years for Herrera to finally pay for his actions. Thanks to the confession of Joaquin, who had mentioned identifying him, not to mention the rest of the Avenue's members who also testified against him, Herrera was at the end of his ropes. What was never known was who the murderer of Steven Morales was. Although some Avenue's members testified, they avoided mentioning names and affiliations. After several police interviews, it was concluded that Alvaro Herrera murdered the child and was the driver of the vehicle, and so he was swiftly convicted, getting life without parole. A few months after his arrest, on April 14, 2007, early in the morning, a violent incident occurred that shook the streets near downtown. Presliana Juarez and Charnel West, the latter a member of the Clover Street gang, left a restaurant on 20th Street near North Broadway, accompanied by another couple affiliated with Clover Street. With Juarez behind the wheel and West in the passenger seat, they drove toward the intersection of North Broadway and Lincoln Park Avenue. Their drive was interrupted when a blue minivan approached their car from the passenger side. Suddenly, a man, identified only by a black hoodie with flames on the sleeves, began shooting at Juarez's car from the open sliding door of the minivan. Despite Juarez's attempts to flee, the minivan gave chase until they finally reached a nearby hospital. A woman named Chanel West was shot in the chest and succumbed to her injuries. But fortunately, due to the intense gunfire and chaos, a police officer approached the area and followed the minivan until it stopped near an overpass. A Hispanic male wearing a dark jacket and holding a bag jumped out of the car and fled along the railroad tracks. The police investigation revealed that the minivan involved in the shooting belonged to an individual known as Michael Goodness, who's associated with Dogtown. In addition, evidence found in the minivan linked Anthony Anguiano, another Dogtown member, to the crime. This led to the reopening of Anthony's case, which was cold. As we know, the gun ballistics test had not been done, but when they found a backpack belonging to Anthony's son filled with weapons, he automatically became a suspect, and subsequent forensic tests proved that it was his. It was discovered that the bullets, shell casings, and fragments recovered from the shooting that killed Joseph Cabrera in July 2001 matched Anguiano's gun. On the other hand, when the investigation was reopened, they decided to question Ramos, a survivor of the previous melee, who could only partially see the shooter during the shooting. Initially, he couldn't identify Anguiano in a photo lineup conducted shortly after the incident. However, about 6 years after the crime, Ramos finally identified Anguiano as the shooter in a second photo lineup conducted in September 2007. All of this can be said to have been the turning point that ultimately led to Anthony's arrest and life sentence. Fast forward to 2010, when a police officer was driving an unmarked car near the housing projects on the outskirts of Dogtown. In a chance encounter, the cop made eye contact with the approaching driver, identified as Miguel. Upon noticing the presence of the officer, Miguel approached aggressively and positioned himself next to the driver's side of the patrol car, along with his companion Ruben, who pointed their guns at him before realizing he was a uniformed police officer. Both decided to flee in the vehicle, and the officer called for backup and chopper support.
Get him ears on his feet, get to the chopper! Get to the chopper!
The chase didn't last long as the helicopter pinpointed their location, leading to their apprehension. In the ensuing trial, both Miguel and Ruben were convicted of assault with a semi-automatic weapon. Outro. The Dogtown 13 gang, the oldest in Los Angeles, was forged in the shadows of 19th century crime. White Fence, 18th Street, Clanton, Temple Street, and Hotel 13 definitely belong in the conversation of LA's oldest barrios, but DTR13 sits firmly at number 1. Originating as a Sicilian enclave in the 1870s, it evolved from an indoctrinated branch of the Matranga and Black Hand mafias into an independent street outfit. Over the years, its influence grew, leaving its mark on the city's criminal history. From deadly crashes with rivals to violent shootouts in the streets, Dogtown demonstrated its power. They never completely faded away, now more of a symbol than a gang, but still dormant. If you enjoyed this story about an old LA neighborhood, check out this video from our series, LA Stories.